Sound check. I'm always excited when I'm getting video recorded. Okay, so thank you all for being here, particularly the first session on Saturday morning. My talk is called Behavioral Experiments in Charitable Giving, which is as abstract as you can be. Sort of could fit in any of the sessions. But this session, Social Identity, is about identity. And so this is actually a talk about identity in charitable giving. This is joint work with Catherine Milkman, who's my colleague at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. All right, so there's lots of research, much of which you've heard about over the day yesterday, and you'll hear more about today, about behavioral economics and charity. And so there's been a variety of different types of interventions leveraging a bunch of different psychological and economic forces that have been successful to increase charitable giving. And we want to add to that, and I think one of the nice things about charitable giving for these behavioral economics interventions is that it's a test bed to see what persuasion techniques are very effective at getting people to take actions that they might not otherwise take. So while we're interested in charitable giving in its own right, and there are practitioners in the room, we also think about these strategies as also being successful in other contexts as well. All right, so I've listed a few of these behavioral, econ, and psychological forces here, and we want to add to this literature by thinking about a new force, by thinking about identity. Right, so while we're doing this, we also want to spark ideas and provide lessons for practitioners. And one of the themes of this short talk is that what Steve said last night about using pre-existing data from a charity, we're going to do that. And also we're going to think about the importance of experiments in generating knowledge both for a charity and for generalizable knowledge for us. So why are we interested in identity? Well, psychologists have been saying for a long time that individuals might feel what they call cognitive dissonance when their behavior differs from some conception that they have of themselves. So, for example, I've given this individual identity as a donor, and if I remind them of their identity as a donor, they might feel bad not living up to that. Continue to donate to a particular charity, and so it might be an effective technique that we want to add to the list that I showed you on the first slide. So there's some evidence for this consistency. So a paper by Sherman in 1980 reports the results of an experiment where they called 94 subjects and asked them a hypothetical question of if they were asked to volunteer for the American Cancer Society for 3 hours, what would they say? So some of the subjects got asked that. Other subjects in the 94 got asked some unrelated question about if they would do something else for 3 hours. Then 3 days later, somebody actually came to their door and asked them to volunteer for the American Cancer Society. So who says yes? Well, 31% of the people that were asked hypothetically of whether they would donate, many of whom said, when it's hypothetical, sure, I'll donate, or I'll volunteer for the American Cancer Society. 31% of the people that were asked that question actually said yes, I'll volunteer. Only 4% of the people in the control condition that were asked an unrelated question. All right, so there's some evidence that this kind of consistency with your past statements will be effective. We want to sort of extend that and see if consistency with past actions, particularly actions as a donor, will work as well. We're also interested in identity and other types of identity. So you have an individual identity maybe as a donor, but you also identify with other groups. And so you might feel as though if we prime your identity as part of another group, you might feel like you represent that group and want to do well by that group, look good for that group. So the motivating example I use for this is an example from my childhood. When I was a kid, I got sent to sleepaway camp. So spent 8 weeks at a camp in the Adirondacks. And whenever they took us, this preteens, off the grounds, they said, when you're off the campgrounds, you're not just representing yourself, you're representing Grand Lake Camp. And that made us, that rhetoric worked, that we sort of behaved much better outside of camp because we knew it wasn't just about us, it was about the camp and the camp's reputation. All right, so we want to look for these types of identity. We want to see if we can prime them, do they actually change giving behaviors.
Why do you call this identity rather than good old-fashioned guilt?
So it may be guilt, but it may be guilt that's driven through this identity change.
Actually, it may be 50 different things related to the striking assault and one that starts results.
So one of the things that I'll show you the appeals that we're going to analyze, and then later on at the end we'll have a discussion about sort of what it might be. We're calling it identity, but what else might it be? And we can figure out if we want to call it something else. So what are we going to do? We're analyzing existing data from the American Red Cross. And they have a list that they gave us access to of they call it the START donor strategy through applied analytics, research, and testing is the name of this database of potential donors, 1.2 million potential donors, all of whom had given to American Red Cross in response to Hurricane Rita, the Southeast Asian tsunami. And they were trying to encourage these individuals who had donated unsolicited in response to a disaster to become more regular donors to the Red Cross. And so they sort of kept this list, this database separate, and they gave us access to historical giving for this group and all the appeals that they sent between January 2009 and October 2011. All right, so what we did when we got this was we said, we're interested in this pre-existing data, but we know that this is the test bed for the American Red Cross. We're going to look for experiments that they ran. And then we're going to analyze the effect of experiments that we think of as being of theoretic interest. All right, so during this period, there were 31 experiments that the Red Cross ran. So by experiment, I mean same group of subjects, of potential donors, sent different pieces of mail randomly assigned. And we looked through the creatives that we had creatives for 20 of these experiments, and we looked to see what the experiment was. So many of them is just 2 different letters, totally different, very valuable experiment for the Red Cross as they're honing their materials, nothing generalizable that we can say about, if one is more successful than the other. We don't know why, we just know this letter worked better. But some of the experiments, in particular 2, were experiments that varied something very small about the letter, about the direct mail piece. And seem to be about identity, although we'll talk about exactly what we think they're doing. And we rank them on this theoretic interest spectrum before we looked at the results. All right, so these experiments together, it's 60,000 direct mail appeals. They generated about $200,000. And I'll tell you about each of them in turn. So the first one is a campaign. We call it the Identity as a Previous Donor campaign. And the letters were identical, except that in the top left corner of the solicitation letter, where they had the name and address of the potential donor, they put, for randomly selected letters, the date of the previous gift. Okay. So this is the intervention right here. Everything else is the same. And they sent it to people who were in this database who had donated between 2 years ago and 4 years ago, but had not donated since. So what do we see when we look at the results of this appeal? So the control group actually quite high response rates, and lots of these people had made an unsolicited donation to the Red Cross, so their general proclivity to give is high, but they don't give to every appeal. The control group gave 6% of them made a donation. But we get a statistically significant increase when we include the date of the last gift. And so this is very highly significant. We see the effect also in the amount of the donation. Okay, so average donation across the zeros and the donors. Right here there's lots of, or there's a few, I should say, outliers, people who give $5,000 that sort of make the statistical precision quite hard. So we take the highest donors and we sort of lower their donations. It's a statistical analysis trick. So the actual average donations are a little bit higher, right? But we see this consistent effect not just on the likelihood of donation, but on average donations. And essentially what's happening is that the conditional on giving, the donations are the same, and so this increase in the likelihood of giving is leading to higher average donations in total. So donation amount, I said, is conditional on giving is identical across the conditions. And then because we have the data going out through October of 2010, we can see whether the individuals give to the next appeal whether the likelihood of giving is affected. We see no effect on the likelihood of giving to the next appeal, and we see no effect on the amount of total future donations in our data. And so this intervention is making people feel like donors. They're responding to that today, and it's not leading to a decrease in donations later on. Yeah, Rob.
So with these 70,000 people, were they not experimented on in the future? So were they part of a control group in the future that was never experimented on?
So right, so this analysis is I like the looking at the next donation, because for the vast majority of the next appeal letter comes 79 days later, and so then and it's, I'm pretty sure for them it's all the same. So that's a nice sort of benchmark. But yes, there's lots of things. Right, we don't control what American Red Cross does. We're looking at pre-existing data. So you'll see in the next experiment, the treatment group that's very effective, they get more appeals in the coming months. We didn't see that for this group. All right, so we summarized this experiment, reminding me that I'm a Red Cross donor. Here's to make me more likely to donate, but not affect my future donations. And so there's a second experiment that we looked at. This was thinking about identity as part of a larger group. So the campaign here was, again, exact same letter, but the letter was to raise money for the national efforts of the American Red Cross. But they varied what the drive was called. Okay, so for some people, the drive was called an annual fund drive. For some, it was called the Winter 2009 State Drive. For others, the name was conditioned on their address. So some people got the Winter 2009 Pennsylvania State Drive, and the last group got the Winter 2009 Philadelphia City Community Drive. Or actually, sorry, just the Philadelphia Community Drive. Okay, so they took the city that you were in and they plugged that in. They took the state that you were in and plugged that in these two treatments. And so I've circled on the envelope, the reply card, and the letter all the places where this name changed. Okay, so for the most part, it's just in the address, the reply address, return address, I should say, for the original appeal. Right? But notice that regardless of the name, it's the money's going and the letter's coming from the DC office of the American Red Cross, the national headquarters. And here in the letter it says right now people throughout Philadelphia are bonding together at a community drive to support the American Red Cross, and that sentence would be a little bit different for the different appeals. So this was sent 10,000 people to each group. All right, sent to this list of subset of this list of start prospects. All right, so what do we see? Well, we see basically a similar effect on the probability of giving for the annual fund, the Winter 2009 fund, and the state fund, or the state drive. But the Winter 2009 City Community Drive is much more effective in generating additional donations. So about 1.5 percentage points, which is a big chunk on the base of about 4% for the other types of letters. So when we look at the giving, again, the average giving, we do the same culling of the data to take the outliers and make them more reasonable to do the statistical test. And again, we see an effect that carries through to average donations. But the city community drive is generating a really big increase in the probability of donation, but sort of a relatively small increase on average donations. And that's because conditional on giving, the gifts to the community drive are smaller. And if you look at the distributions, it turns out that the city community drive is pulling in lots of sort of smaller gifts. The gifts that it's inducing are on average a little bit smaller. Right, so it's still doing better on average, but the biggest effect it's having is on getting additional sort of relatively small donations. So to Rob's question, there is a response of the charity. They send more appeals over the next set of months to this group. But they're also more likely to give to these future appeals. So for every appeal that they get, the probability that someone who was randomly assigned to the city community drive, the probability that they give to a future appeal is a little bit higher than if they were in one of the other three treatment conditions. Right, so this is a case of we do an effective manipulation, and actually it has additional payouts later on. All right, so we want to understand why community drive is having this big effect. I am claiming that it has something to do with focusing your identity as a member of a local geographic community. That somehow being forced to think about your sort of smaller community, you feel like you're representing them and you want to develop identity. And sort of this is, I'm from New York, so this is one of the only cities in the data set where you can do the analysis that I'm going to do, which is New York. If you live in Manhattan, your city name is New York, and your state name is New York. Okay, so we can look for people whose letters are identical, except that the word state and community have been replaced. Now, unfortunately, there's not a ton of data here, so you'll see the bars that I've been showing that show the statistical precision of the estimates are going to be much bigger. Right, but we see that somehow calling it the community drive, so this is the bar on the right, increases the probability of donation by about 3 times the state drive. And these, in fact, are not statistically significant, but you can get a sense of what we think might be happening, right? That somehow priming the community is going to make you feel like it's, I'm representing New York City. New York State's a really big area, lots of people. Right? New York City, I'm a New Yorker, I'm from New York City. Right? That might have a stronger effect. So this has a logical conclusion. So we're hypothesizing that priming your identity as part of a community makes you feel like you're representing that community. And we're assuming that you want to be a good representative of the community that we're making you identify with. So we should expect to see that in smaller cities, if you're from a smaller city, this city drive manipulation should be more effective at encouraging your donation than if you're from a really big city. So we saw big effects in New York, right? But on average, there are big cities that made me feel less connected to versus a small town that only has maybe 1,000 people in it. You might feel like you're really a representative of that community. You want to show that community is charitable. All right, so we basically do that. We take cities by population, we bin them, and we do the same analysis just looking at cities of different sizes. So this is, rather than explain the whole graph, I'll just say each of these little circles tells you the size of the circle tells you how many observations we're looking at, and the height of the circle on the graph tells you how effective the treatment was, comparing the city community drive to all 3 of the other treatments. Right, so New York is over here, along with Phoenix and Atlanta and other big cities. Right, and the smaller towns are going to be on this side, and we see that the smaller towns getting the drive to be called the community drive creates a bigger effect on the probability of donation for these small cities than for the big cities. So in the last minute or two, we want to think through what alternative hypotheses might drive this effect, particularly the effect of, in smaller cities, calling it the community drive is more effective. Right? And then we want to decide whether we think that this is about identity or about something else. So one hypothesis is that people don't read the letter carefully, and they think that they're giving to their local community rather than giving to the Red Cross. And maybe you think $1 to my community is going to be more effective at providing services in the case of a disaster. So I have a few sort of suggestive things that I think lean against this alternative hypothesis. One is that all the mail is being sent, the letter, the check that you're writing, the envelope you're putting it in, it's all going to the national headquarters. It's not going to your local chapter. Okay, so right there you might think, all right, this is not about my local town. Why would I send the money to the national office? The letter at a bunch of places, and I've pulled one line, but they talk about throughout the letter about how the importance of the American Red Cross in providing services to America, and when they talk about disasters, they don't specify in the letter that the disasters might be specific to your region. They talk about solving or responding to disasters across the country. And another fact, which I think leads against this hypothesis, although we could debate it, is that this effect that we see where the treatment of the community drive is more effective for smaller cities, it only affects the probability of donation, not the amount given. So if I thought that giving to my community was going to be more effective, maybe there would also be an intensive margin effect where I give more when I make a donation. We don't see that. Maybe population's a proxy for something else. I've done similar statistical tests breaking down cities not by size, but by their likelihood of giving to past American Red Cross appeals or by their income, I don't see the same patterns only for population. And last, maybe people in small towns are just more susceptible to these kinds of identity manipulations. So maybe it's about the town, not about the town size. But in the other experiment on previous donations, in fact, the effect is bigger in people from larger cities. All right. So in conclusion, as I see my stop sign, right, we're getting more donations from priming identity, either as a past donor or as a member of a smaller community. And we see that these effects lead to not only to donations today, but they do not appear to decrease donations in the future. Thank you very much.